people online and to the half dozen or so people that we've got in the room in Victoria Terrace. Talk today is by Stewart Stevenson, who is the editor for our journal, and his topic is on bigamy and adultery and related facts. Stewart, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Just by way of introduction, this is something that's come out of the dissertation that I did for my MSc at the University of Strathclyde in genealogical, paleographic and heraldic studies, in other words, genealogy. So this is a relatively small extract from the dissertation that I had done there. So let's get on. That's me. Paul described who I am. I'm also a volunteer at the Genealogy Society, not just the editor of the Scottish Genealogist. So I hope that others might be encouraged to be volunteers as well. So we're going to talk about some socially difficult subjects tonight. There'll be a bit of amusement as well, and I suspect there'll be some questions. But in particular, Scotland is a unique jurisdiction in relation to how we record things like adultery and bigamy, and I'm going to talk you through initially some examples that illustrate what this is about, and then we'll look at some case studies. So, first of all, what is adultery? Well, adultery is something that is not widely regarded as being good behavior. I've put on the screen comments on Judaism. Christians were familiar with the seventh deadly sin, thou shalt not commit adultery. Islamists, Hindus, and in a survey that Yale University did in 2013, worldwide, 75% of people agreed that extramarital affairs are morally unacceptable. As we'll see, that's an interesting figure. We'll come back to that. Now, adultery in births, just before we look at what is an adultery in birth, I should say when I was doing my studies at Strathclyde, I looked at a 5-year period from 1899 to 1903, and I selected some areas of Scotland that I went and looked at to see how many adultery in births there were, what the effects of them were. I have subsequently been doing quite a lot more searching for adultery in births, and I now have 549 records of adultery in births. Actually, that's not true because I got another one yesterday and I haven't updated the presentation. 420 mothers of adultery in children, 171 fathers, and so far I've looked at 160,000 Scottish birth records. If you see my eyes crossing, you'll work out why that might be the case. So, what are adultery in births? Well, the Oxford Dictionary provides 2 definitions for adultery, one of which we can discard. Adulterine castles are castles that were built in the medieval times without the authority of the crown. Well, that's nothing to do with tonight, so we can forget that one. Adultery in births are, as the diagram shows there, where the child's biological parents are not married to each other, and at least one of them was married to someone else during the pregnancy, and the result occurred as a result of adultery. Now, that means that this is not an illegitimate birth. It is an adultery in birth. It is a different thing. We'll come back to that. Now, what started me off, I found kind of by accident, I tripped over in other research, a registration. In this particular case, the one I've chosen to put on the screen, 1902, in the Scottish birth records. Now, it's unusual. The key part of it that identifies the adultery in births is column 4, where we normally see the name, surname, rank and profession of father, the second part of it, name and maiden name of mother, and then the date and place of marriage. All good, familiar information. But when it's an adultery in birth, we get something quite different altogether. And this form of words is prescribed by the inspector of registrars George Bissett Smith, and I have his book at my hand at all times. The second edition was published in 1907, and it prescribes this kind of form of words. So in the particular case that I had on the screen there, it starts off as it would do with illegitimate births, saying who the father is, Robert McDougall, Marine Stoker, who the mother is, Isabella Buchan. It then goes on to say wife of William Coulter, vanman, merchant service. And then this is the important point, who she declares is not the father of the child. And further, she's had no personal communication with him since they ceased to reside together 5 years ago. The personal communication is a very Victorian way of not being terribly explicit about what's being talked about, but you can work out what isn't going on. And this is the form of words we'll get for adultery in records. Now, one of the things that it does mean is when you're looking through birth records, you can quite rapidly spot that column 4 doesn't look like a normal column 4. You can pause and have a look. But the rest of them, you can actually flick over quite quickly. And that's how I've managed to look at 160,000 records. I didn't read them all. You could recognize adultery in births quite quickly. Now, the couple here, having had this adultery in birth in Scotland, they moved to England and went to Liverpool. And in 1905, they had a further child, Hector Lachlan Coulter or Buchan, Buchan being the original name of the mother, Coulter being her married name. Now, if you look at the record, you'll see that what's missing from the record, as you would expect in an illegitimacy, there's no name of or surname of a father, no rank or profession of a father. But there's nothing on the record whatsoever to say that this is an adultery in birth. Because Scotland is, in fact, the only jurisdiction in the world that provides for a method by which adultery in births can be recorded to show that they are adultery in births. The way they're recorded does change shortly after 1919. We stopped recording the word illegitimate on registrations in December 1918. And the way in which we recorded adultery in births also changed and became a bit simpler and didn't include the declares that he is not the father, but still, by showing what it did, you can still see that it's an adultery in birth if you understand what's going on. But in England, there's nothing whatsoever. If you didn't know that this couple had had the previous adultery in birth in Scotland and you hadn't seen that first, upon finding this in the English records, you wouldn't imagine necessarily that that's an adultery in birth. You probably would conclude it's an illegitimate birth and the father has not been declared. Now, when we look 6 years further on at the census for this family, Isabella McDougall is shown as the wife on here. We can see here at number 2, and she's been married for 14 years. She has 5 children, all of whom are living. Now, the reality is, yes, she has been married for 14 years, but not to Mr. McDougall. She's still married to Mr. Coulter. And as it happens in this particular case, Mr. McDougall isn't in the household. I don't actually know where he is. I've had a good look and I haven't found him. The schedule does show that the head of the household is Mr. McDougall, but he doesn't appear as someone who's present during the census. But we can see the names of these children. They're all named as McDougall, although the first 2 of them actually, of course, had other surnames at birth. But they've all adopted the name of the father, the person living with the mother, as being their name. So nothing terribly unusual about that, except that Mr. McDougall's absent. Now, the husband of Isabel Buchan is still living, and indeed he remains living until 1916. He dies in Aberdeen. He's shown as married to Isabella Buchan, so we know that marriage is continuing, and the registration of the death is made by his brother-in-law, who's also living in Aberdeen. So that's the kind of thing that you get. They go on in 1920, Isabella Buchan and Robert McDougall, to give birth to their 6th child, Patricia Isabel McDougall. This, of course, was after the death of her husband, so therefore is not an adulterine birth, but was an illegitimate birth. But once again, because they're still living in England, we can see on the record here that there is no name of a father and no rank or profession of a father. But again, there's nothing on here to say that it's illegitimate, because as in Scotland, where we stopped recording illegitimate on registrations, so in England at the same time, they stopped providing details, although there are further complications, but this is a short presentation. Now, we'll just talk a little bit about the legal underpinnings for all this. And basically, the key thing that you want to look at is this principle of Roman law. In other words, it's a very old principle, pater escem justae nupice demonstrant. In other words, the father is the whom the righteous demonstrate in marriage. In other words, if you're married to a woman, all the children of that woman during the marriage are legally yours, regardless of the biology involved. And this is still the case now, and the most recent piece of Scottish legislation I found is only 5 years ago, which states a man shall be presumed to be the father of a child if he was married to or in a civil partnership with the mother of the child at any time in the period beginning with the conception and ending with the birth of the child. It doesn't say he has to biologically be the father of the child for him to be legally presumed to be the father of the child. And of course, I think the phrasing is quite interesting, because it's perfectly possible, of course, that the mother of the child could be married to more than one person during the period of conception. But the legal drafting doesn't take any account of that. Ho-hum. Right, now, a little bit about evidence. In Scotland, we require in the courts evidence to be corroborated, in other words, to come from two independent sources. But uniquely, in relation to paternity, the mother's word is final and requires no corroboration. It's semi-plana, literally a half-truth, which only she provides, and she will be trusted. But if a husband wants to go to court to dispute her claim, he requires to provide two sources of evidence before he will be believed, even though the mother, who has registered that the husband is not the father of a child and doesn't require corroboration, she is believed in law without corroboration. Little wrinkle, interesting thing. So let's talk about a few case histories. Now, you'll immediately see Agnes Rankin Strachan lived to a pretty decent old age, actually. She lived to 85. And I don't know why this is the case, but most of the adultering mothers seem to have had relatively long lives. So maybe adultery is actually quite good for you, but let's not go there. There's no supporting evidence. Now, Agnes Rankin Strachan, she had a legal marriage, then she had a bigamous marriage, and then she had another legal marriage. And during all this time, she had one lawful child, that's the marriage, then 5 adulterine children during the bigamous marriage, and then 2 lawful children. So how did this all happen? Well, Alexander Anderson, who was a widower, that's incidental, married Agnes Rankin Strachan, 1888, Episcopal wedding. You can see here from the certificate that Alexander, the widower, was 40 and Agnes was only 22. Whether that's of any relevance to what happened or not, who knows? But there's a big gap. Now, the second marriage, a bigamous marriage, or perhaps a lie, happened when Alfred Henry Trustwell married Agnes Rankin Strachan. That is according to a Scottish birth record of 1897. And there are some other ones that give similar information, but not identical information. And it says that Agnes is married to Alfred Henry Trustwell, and that they got married in London. Now, this is a Scottish birth. We've got a marriage in London, a very specific date, 28th of May, 1894, and it's recorded by Alfred H. Trustwell. Now, I haven't been able to find any such marriage in English records. Well, sometimes one can't find them. That might be down to my incompetence and inadequacies, or it might be that there is no such marriage. And indeed, when we come to another birth that Alfred Trustwell and Agnes Strachan had in 1901, we suddenly get back to this adultery form of registration. But in this case, it's a variant on it in that it says Agnes Strachan or Anderson, widow of Alexander Anderson, ship steward, who was drowned at sea on the 26th of June and whom she declares is not the father of the child. Now, the 26th of June is actually only a month before the birth. So clearly he would have still been alive and around to be able to be party to the conception of the child. But he has died. And that is now declaring that this child is actually an adulterine child, whereas the previous one, 6 years earlier, they didn't declare that. They pretended that they were married. Now, why might one do that? Well, it actually avoids the child being illegitimate, is perhaps one of the things it's worth saying. The registration is like an illegitimate registration. It requires both the mother and the father to attend the registration and to sign the documents. And that's what we see here. And the key thing is, when you go and check about this alleged death of Alexander Anderson, you find it's actually true. He was on a ship that sunk off the Isles of Scilly on the date that's claimed, or near enough on that date, shall we say, because it's not entirely clear from the news reports. So that's an interesting variant. Again, an adulterine birth, but a slightly different one. Now, Alfred Henry Trustwell now marries Agnes Rankin Strachan, despite the fact that they'd previously been claimed to have married in London. He is now on a Scottish marriage a few months after the death that we've just dealt with there. He is now declaring himself to be a bachelor. So they're getting themselves in a right guddle altogether. Agnes Strachan, on the other hand, she is correctly declaring herself to be a widow. We can see that they're living together at 26 Dechmont Street, Parkhead, Glasgow, and the birth that we've just looked at was at that same address. So they're getting themselves in a good old muddle, one way or another. Let's look at another case, Elizabeth Dudgeon. Elizabeth Dudgeon didn't live quite so long as others, but then she had a really quite exciting life. She had a legal marriage, then a bigamous marriage, then an annulment after conviction, all within 167 days. That all happened. 2 adulterine children and 1 illegitimate one. So, how did this all happen? Charles Wilson married Elizabeth Dudgeon 1st of June 1894 at 13 Hill Place, Edinburgh, in the Church of Scotland. She, within a very short space of time, 12th of September the same year, she goes and marries James Duthie at 3 John Street, Church of Scotland. Now, it's worth making the point, and I actually went out and did the walk just to check. It's only 9 minutes walk between these 2 churches, both Church of Scotland. And you sort of think to yourself, how on earth did she think she was going to get away with this? And of course, the reality is, well, she didn't. She found herself pursued for bigamy and was in court on the 15th of November, 1894. And of course, what that caused was 2 things. First of all, she got prosecuted for bigamy, but secondly, of course, the second marriage was annulled because, of course, you cannot in law be married twice. So any second marriage, any bigamous marriage does not actually exist in law. And this lassie did this. Quite extraordinary, really, that someone would have thought they'd get away with this. But she did for a very short space of time. Now, looking at some other cases, Betsy Esplin Bell, and this is a fine photograph of her, it does slightly illustrate that there may be some slight benefits to AI or artificial intelligence, which helpfully coloured the black and white photograph that I managed to obtain from Dundee City Library. It also improved her complexion, so she looks half a fine in the picture here. And once again, you'll see she lived a fair decent time, and yet she had quite a tough life. Her father abandoned her when she was 3 years old, or maybe a little earlier, and went to Australia, where he married someone else and had 12 adulterine children in Australia. Now, if you go to Australia, they probably aren't looking at Scottish records to see if what they're being told is valid. And certainly he doesn't seem to have ever been found to have been an adulterer, to have been a bigamist. Betsy, too, marries, and her husband deserts her and becomes a bigamist. And she has one lawful daughter. But the key story really about poor Betsy is that she appears on my radar because there was a story of her 100th conviction in the Dundee courts. And here's some of them. 28 drunken, incapable, 7 breach of the peace, 3 riotous conduct, 2 each loitering, obscene language, breach of the Licensing Scotland Act 1903. And that's not them all, because the record is incomplete, I'm afraid. The prison in Dundee doesn't have all the admissions for the relevant period when she would have been going there, and the court records are not complete either. But even so, you can see there was a lot of them. And the report of the last one that appears in the record is the 158th conviction of Betsy Esplin Bell. Now, you have to say it was a bit of a waste of time and money for the state doing all this, because her longest time in prison was less than a month. So the cost of putting her through the court, processing her and everything else, tremendous. Now, loitering, do you all know what loitering is? You know what it is now. But in that period of time, loitering was an offence, and it was a lady standing in the corner of the street asking passing gentlemen if they wanted a good time. Breach of the Licensing Scotland Act 1903, which is where that photograph came from, is an interesting one. It was an attempt to deal with chronic alcoholism and people who were offending under the influence of alcohol, in that if you'd had 3 convictions in the previous few months, the local authority had to publish a publication with a list and photographs of all these people, and they were forbidden to go and buy alcohol. And then if somebody who sold alcohol sold them alcohol, they would be prosecuted. So this publication was produced and issued. However, it was a total waste of time, had no effect whatsoever on this, because, of course, they weren't really, in any meaningful sense, trying to do anything about the underlying cause of Betsy Esplin Bell's problems, which was an addiction and dependency upon alcohol. Annie McNaughton. Now, Annie McNaughton lived quite a long time. She was 78. Annie, an interesting variation on what can go on. Marriage, separation, resumption. 3 lawful children, and then she had 2 adulterine children, and her husband was in prison. Except it's not as simple as that, because she had the first adulterine, she conceived the first adulterine child, at least, before her husband went into prison. So the fact he was in prison kept him away from her for a wee while. He would certainly have been in prison when the second adulterine child was conceived. But when he came out, they just resumed the marriage and had a further child. So it's an interesting case where the adultery didn't seem to have caused the whole marriage to have broken down irretrievably. And indeed, when her husband died in 1936, Annie registered the death. So lots of variants here. Now, we come to the last bit of the title that I have given this particular talk, which is Bigamy, Adultery and Murder. And so far we have talked about bigamy and adultery. We're now about to talk about murder. And if you're of a sensitive nature, I can tell you I have excluded some of the more lurid parts of what I might tell you, which are available in the precognitions and the court records related to the murder of Helen Brady in 1907. So let's look at the individuals who have party to this, starting with Felix Wallace. Felix was born in Kilmarnock in 1866, and Felix became a criminal at an early age, at the age of 12, when he went into a shop in Ayr and he stole socks. He was in with a group of other young people and he ended up being sent to prison for 21 days as a 12-year-old. That was the way things were in those days. He then had a relative period of peace, except he didn't, but that's another story. And he married Teresa Daisy, which can be spelled D-A-I-S-Y or S-E-Y. Unusual spelling, but there you are, who is a widow, and he married her in Edinburgh. But no sooner has he done that than he finds himself that same year in the Edinburgh City Police Court having assaulted his wife, and he gets 8 days in prison for his impudence. He, as the newspaper report in the Edinburgh Evening News in September that year says, he actually committed a breach of peace on his wife, but also a young woman called Trailer, in a shop in Westport, not far away from where the society is based. But he wasn't finished at that. The very next year, he was in court again, more assaults, 3 previous convictions on this occasion for assaulting his wife. And this time, on this particular one that I found in March 1888, he assaulted a couple of people and kicked a constable who was trying to apprehend him. This time he got sent to prison for 30 days with hard labour. I think we can begin to see a pattern here that Felix Wallace is not someone who particularly pays attention to the law. And even more assaults in 1888, and including using salt herrings in a dish that he threw at his wife, and the contact made was a violent one. But he put that up, but he'd been assaulting his prison. And you'll notice where this particular newspaper item has come from. It's come from the Derry Journal across the Irish Sea. And indeed, there are other articles about Felix Wallace activities, including throwing herrings at his wife, as far south as Brighton. All over the UK, this fella is making a name for himself through the courts and becoming well-known, or perhaps ill-known would be better. Now, his wife, not unreasonably, decides enough is enough. And in 1888, towards the end of it, and remember, they only got married in 1887, and we've already been talking about umpteen assaults by him on her, she goes to the court to get a legal separation from her husband. And the court's activities appear to have been somewhat unusual. It says in the report, and journalists, of course, have got special legal permission, they are believed without corroboration again. A fortnight after the marriage, he began to ill-treat her and to get drunk. That's what the court was hearing. The defender had been 5 times in prison for assaulting her. On one occasion, we said it all. During the year of the marriage, she only got 9 shillings and 6pence from her. And then the guy appears in the court, and an unwashed-looking individual. "I am here," his lordship says. "Is that the defender?" He explained he was the husband. And he then starts to engage directly with the court, which wasn't a terribly good thing. He bounds to his feet at one point and says to the counsel, "You're a liar." The husband says that he'll sit quiet now, and his lordship says, "Okay, you get a second chance." But of course, that's not quite what happened. And you can get the point when the journalist has more or less given up, when his lordship says, "What have you got to say?" And the journalist says, the husband says, "Humph." And eventually he gets led away out of the court. So he hadn't quite, but of course, he was doing some other things besides I've described, which is his relationship with his wife. Here's a list, and it's only some of his convictions. And there are a whole host of different things. He got one of them's for poaching, another one is for staying in somebody's shed without permission, etc., etc. He was a thoroughly bad lot. But he wasn't just a bad lot in court. He wasn't just a bad lot in bullying and assaulting his wife. He was a bad lot altogether. December 1892, he is reported in recognitions that we will see later relating to the murder, that he misbehaves with Helen Brady, who's a married woman. And in January 1894, Helen Brady gives birth to Patrick Ross, naming her husband, William Ross, as the father. But William Ross, her husband, doesn't seem to have known anything about Patrick Ross. And the misbehavior that Felix Wallace had with Helen Brady strongly suggests that he would have been the father. And it's an interesting one if he is, because this is a double adultery in birth in January 1894, because Wallace, who's married to someone else, because she's still alive, she does die shortly, he commits adultery with someone who's married to someone else. So both of them are adulterers and give birth to this adultering child. And in the period after that, they start to live together, Felix Wallace and Helen Brady. And through to October 1905, he fathers 6 adultering children with Helen Brady. So he was busy in lots of parts of his life. Now, Helen Brady, bit of a mystery around here. I suspect that she probably came from Ireland. The only census record I've been able to find that has her in it is a 1901 census, and in there it suggests she was born in Melrose. The reality is I can find no record under all sorts of variety of names that I've looked at, and in 1870 I cannot find her. And I can't find her in any of the previous Scottish censuses as well. I'm just going to have to look a bit harder in future. She marries William Ross in Galashiels. They're both shown as hawkers. They're already living together, and she's 18 when that happens. And between 1889 and 91, she has a couple of lawful sons with her husband, William Ross. Now, on the adulterine births to which she's party, the separation date from her husband is often given, and in this case, always given, but she gives various separation dates on various births. So it's anything between 1892 and 1894. She continues to give birth, the last one, as I said earlier, 1905. Now, the post-mortem examination, when she got murdered in August 1907 between 31 and 33 Bonington Road in Leith. Wallace kicked Helen Brady to death. I'm only showing you one part of the post-mortem examination, which is just a handwritten diagram on a pre-printed picture. And you can see that on the left-hand side, we've got 1, 2, 3 ribs that are broken twice, and another rib that's broken another 3 ribs that are broken once. And on the right-hand side, all but 3 of her ribs are broken. But even more fundamentally, the bone that's in the middle of the body, the sternum, is also broken. And it's one of the strongest bones in the body. So you don't have to have a particularly vivid imagination to realize just how brutal the assault that Felix Wallace had on Helen Brady had been. And there's more in the precognitions that give further evidence of that, but we don't need to dwell on that. The sentence, of course, because he was arrested at the scene by 2 police constables. The sentencing, because he pleaded guilty to culpable homicide. Now, I have to say, of course, if he'd been found guilty of murder in 1907, that would have without doubt have been a hanging offence. So pleading guilty of culpable homicide was probably a relatively sensible thing for him to do. And in those days, when he pleaded guilty, there actually would have been no trial and no testing of the evidence, which was probably good news for Wallace. So one way or another, that was the sentence, the plea that was entered by him and accepted by the court. Now, Mr. Fraser on behalf of Wallace said he grounds for jealousy against the woman who was of drunken habits and very bad-tempered. Well, it's interesting. We've seen a long history of misbehavior by Felix Wallace, but we've actually not seen anything significant about his wife. So we can be quite confident that Felix Wallace was the really bad one in the partnership. Now, I think we both loved the drink, and that was probably a problem. And then we've got these quotes here that I've dropped out on the left there. Wallace's counsel, woman of drunken habits may have bad temper. Well, maybe. And then one of the sons, you have been a good father to us and also kind to mother. So kind to mother that he was constantly in court for assaulting his previous wife and indeed for assaulting Helen Brady. And then his counsel says, previous good character and steady behaviour of Wallace. Well, really? Well, it just shows you that the internet, which now allows information to flow across the world, does deliver one benefit, because clearly nobody in the court could have known about his long history, because he only got sent to prison for 7 years, which, when you look at the severity of the attack and everything else, you find quite bizarre. He got sent to Peterhead Prison, which used to be in the parliamentary constituency I represented. It was a prison that was actually built by the prisoners. There was a quarry a mile away, and there was a railway transported the stone and everything up. It ended up being the hard man's prison. Jimmy Boyle, now a reformed murderer, was there, and the Limbs and the Loch murderer, William Beggs, was there as well. He, of course, still doesn't admit his crimes. It's now a museum, and a modern replacement to this Victorian prison is alongside it. Now, the records relating to Wallace's incarceration are incomplete, so I had to simply read, for the period I presumed he was there, the governor's diary, and there's no reference at all that I could find to Wallace, which suggests he may have behaved himself in prison. But then he probably wasn't getting alcohol. Who knows? Now let's look at, just to sort of wrap this up before we have a discussion and take questions, with just some general facts and figures from the research that I've done. One of the things that caught me right at the end of my research, which showed that I had a bit of what psychologists call confirmation bias. In other words, I'd assumed when I started to look at adultery and adultery in births, that the adultery would lead to marital breakdown. And yet, from the records that I've found, that in almost all cases, the recorded breakdown came before the adultery in births. So it suggests that it wasn't the adultery that caused the breakdown caused the adultery. But I think we need to be a little bit skeptical, because, of course, people, when it suits them, don't always record the actual facts of certain matters. Rather similarly to illegitimate births, a good proportion, nearly 2 in 5, of the adultery in births had the biological father go along and declare that he was the father. We also note, when we look at where the adultery in births are, that being near a military base seems to crank up the number. But the interesting thing, perhaps overall, is that for the children who were born as adulterine children, they mostly seem to go on and live perfectly normal lives in stable relationships. So let's just have a look at some of the numbers. For my MSc, I looked at 45,000 records. As I said, I've now looked at 160,000, and ranking them, we can see top of the list is Blair Gowrie, but that's a small place. I've only got 4 adultery births, and it really doesn't tell you a true story because those 4 births are all by the same woman. St Giles, however, which you would think would be a posh part of Edinburgh, actually it was a comparatively poor part of Edinburgh. We've got the highest proportion of 0.74% of the births were adultery. And St Giles, of course, being immediately next to and including Edinburgh Castle, was very close to a military base. And if you go a wee bit further down the hill, Canongate comes in next at 0.48% of births. And Perth, which was a big military base, home of the Black Watch, again at the top. Govan, which was not a military town, was, however, a town which had experienced a vast influx of new people, not the stable long-term environment you got in many other places. So it was an industrial town with many new people from Ireland, from all over the place. So perhaps not surprising it was there. Burnt Ireland, curiously enough, is an industrial town, a harbour town, no adultery in births at all. I did also look at illegitimate births in these places to see if there was a correlation. And I think all one can conclude is there is no correlation between the number of adultery births and the number of illegitimate births in a particular area. Now, a wee bit of statistics about the mothers. Nothing particularly odd about them. Age first marriage, 17 minimum, 28 maximum. Nothing particularly odd about that. Years to separation, quite a wide range. Years after marriage to adultery and child, some very rapidly, some quite a long time, etc., etc. The faith under which people are married, heavily skewed to Church of Scotland, but I think that's just an issue with the sample that I chose, because when I did my further research, which involved looking at all the births in 1901, the Church of Scotland proportion shrunk quite a bit and with a more even balance between the different faiths. And of course, the faith that were married under first is merely an approximate estimate of the faith of people involved. Divorces, well, not too surprisingly, there were quite a few divorces came out of the adultery system, and this table gives you some of them. Quite variable. The average period between divorce and remarriage, 1.5 years. Not all divorces. Divorce was easier in Scotland than it was in England. The reasons for separation are given on the registrations, but I don't think they should be trusted. There was no standard way of describing them. And anyway, this is only what the mother says. And I don't think we should take anything very much from that. Socioeconomic category. Well, Rebecca Probert, who's looked at divorce, bigamy and bereavement in England, comes up with the same conclusion that I do, that essentially we're looking at a working class phenomenon. Although Kinsey, when he did his reports in 1948 and 1953 into the sexual behaviour of Americans, suggested that adultery was a middle class hobby rather than a working class hobby. But the evidence I have and that Rebecca Probert has come up with suggests otherwise. And the socioeconomic category, we're simply using the job as a surrogate for working out what that is. Now, just to close it off, a few odd examples, which are a little bit different from the norm. First one, Margaret Curry, who's a widow of James Young, who died in 1901, whom she declares is not the father of the child. Right, so that's the case. Then we've got the mother is deceased, and she's the wife of Andrew Robson of Armagh, with whom she has not cohabited for over 7 years. So it reminds us that childbirth was often not very safe in those days. And in this case, we've got the father, Alexander MacFarlane, the mother, Emma Bannister, wife of Edinburgh, who prior to her death declared to informant that her husband was not the father of the child, and no personal communication. So in this case, we've got the adultering father has survived, the mother has died in childbirth. And then we've got one here, which is just a little bit odd. in that it's talking about somebody who died somewhere else exactly 9 months before the birth. I wonder why they bothered to do that. And then we've got one here, Martha Hoselut, who is probably from Poland, but is shown as Polish-Russian, but may also be from Lithuania, wife of Francis Kieslowski, coal miner, to whom she was married in the 19th January 1901, but who she declares was not the father of the child. In other words, she was pregnant when she got married to Francis Kieslowski. So that again is another variant of adultery in births. And then just a little, tiny little bit to say here. This is the tool I use for doing things, Family Tree Maker, and it helps you. Right, few final thoughts. Historically, adultery has been studied by people looking at court records of divorce and paternity. That's repeatable. You go and look at it, you should get the same answers as previous people, but it's a big effort. Kinsey, on the other hand, recruited mainly through women's magazines, cohorts of 5,500 people for his 2 reports. But only about a couple of hundred of them talked about their adulterous experiences. And it was anecdotal evidence. And even Kinsey himself accepts that it probably isn't reliable. Martin Lamerzo, who's a professor in Belgium, has been doing some very interesting work using Y-DNA testing to reveal adultery. And now I've come up with a repeatable, verifiable way of finding adulterers, and hence giving us the way of assembling cohorts we can study. Right, we're now ready, Paul, for questions and discussion. And I hand it back to you to moderate that side of things, Paul.
Thank you, Stewart. I'll use the speaker in the room here rather than using the speaker on my phone on my computer here now. Can I invite any questions from the floor from within Victoria Terrace, first of all? And if anybody's got any questions online, if you could raise your hand or put a comment up. We've got stunned silence in Edinburgh. Just going to put the comments up. No, that's the comments that would come in during the meeting about a little bit of a sound problem with one person, but that's all. Rebecca, you've got your hand up if you'd like to come off mute.
Hi, I just wondered, were a lot of these people just not able to divorce because it was so difficult at the time? Or is there any evidence to suggest that they may have sought divorce later on?
You're on mute, Stewart.
Sure.
That's a good question, Rebecca. It's worth saying that there was equality of access to divorce by men and women in Scotland from the mid-1600s, whereas in England that was not achieved until the 1930s. So the English experience of divorce, and in fact until the mid-1850s, you had to get an Act of Parliament to be able to be divorced in England, whereas in Scotland you could get divorced much more simply. However, divorce was not cheap. At a time we're talking about, the average wage of a working class person would be less than £20 a year. And the cost of a divorce at that time was about £30. So it was quite a lot of money. However, in Scotland uniquely, the poor law provided the minister in the area said that the wife had suffered perhaps by physical bullying or mental bullying with her husband. The poor law could pay for the divorce for women, and it did so in a relatively small number of cases. But nonetheless, there was an avenue in Scotland that wasn't available in other jurisdictions, in particular our neighbours in England. But there were quite a lot of divorces, more than I expected to find, I must say. but still only a minority, because at the end of the day, it didn't really matter very much, because they weren't arguing over the spoils of the marriage, money, owning houses or anything like that, because they didn't. There wasn't much. So in practical terms, it was just as easy to shack up with a new partner and start a new family. It was just as easy, and it didn't cost you any real money.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll come to Gail now, please.
Oh, hi, Stuart. That was really interesting. Thank you. I was just going to make a comment that from experience working for the Social Security Office, I used to do interviews on living together as husband and wife. And in a number of cases, sadly, it discovered that the lady who had been living with the deceased gentleman was completely unaware that he had been married, and his actual wife had been refusing to give him a divorce. So in the outcome being that the original wife, who had not been on the scene for 20 odd years, actually qualified for his pension, whereas the poor lady who had had children to this man that she believed had no idea that he was previously married, didn't get anything. So in a sense, it was a sort of adultery plus bigamy plus illegitimate children, but with a sort of like lack of knowledge about what was going on.
Yes, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And in the 45 minutes I allocated for one of my remarks, I couldn't cover everything that I found. And I found some examples of that in the hundreds of women that I was looking at. But it's worth saying, of course, the legal position, as you're probably aware, has now changed in terms of by the ends. But also, one of the interesting things is there is actually a file in National Records of Scotland. It's reference GRO 5/97, which is about prosecutions for bigamy. But prosecutions for bigamy where the marriage has not been registered. It was still possible for people who were living together as husband and wife, common law wife, or wife by habit and repute, they could still find themselves being sued for bigamy. And that particular file has got 200 pages of things about it. Now, it's not, it's kind of notes and discussions between officials. It's not a very systematic view of things. So it's obviously the whole thing here has been an issue for officialdom as well as for the individuals, that I think that in reality has just never been properly resolved. But all you can come up with is adultery isn't good for you.
Gail, does that answer your question? You're on mute.
Did you ever find, Stewart, Polly here, did you ever find any cases where the husband, if you like, disputed, tried to say they were actually the father of the child?
No.
No, I just wondered. No, I just wondered if you'd got, because I could see that, there could be a dynamic somewhere where the wife saying no, not the father of the child, in fact, the husband is the father of the child.
Yes, but
weird. Yeah.
Let me qualify that though by just drawing your attention to the fact that I have been looking at a specific record type.
Yeah.
Which wouldn't necessarily get me to the point of understanding. Yeah. Although I would have expected that if there'd been a change, there would be a register of corrected associated with the birth record that would say something, and I haven't seen any of those.
Okay.
Debbie, we'll come to you. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, Stuart. That was really interesting. I've got a really heavy cold, and I think it's affecting my brain and understanding. But something I just wanted you to clarify, please. If there was a situation where the woman is single, but the man is married to someone else, that's just going to be recorded as illegitimate, isn't it? Or not illegitimate. It's going to look like the child's illegitimate. I'm sorry, I'm maybe overthinking this, but I just can't work out how that birth certificate would look. Thank you.
Well, you are perfectly correct, but in the case, in law, in the case where the father of the child is not married to the mother of the child, it is legally necessary that the mother goes and does the birth registration. That's the legal position.
Right.
So that's the first point to say. And then, if the father wants to be associated with this, he has to go with the mother to sign it. So therefore, the father can't go along and register it. Well, I mean, we saw an example that I showed you of where the father had gone and done it, but he was pretending to be married, which he wasn't. So that was a different issue. So therefore, the records that there are about adultery in births are all initiated by the mother. So therefore, they will not be the complete story. They just won't. You know, I mean, this is one of the things. It's a window into something, but we shouldn't pretend this is the complete story. And indeed, the researchers who've been looking at adultery in births, various papers, have come up with a wide range. At one extreme, people say 30% of marriages, there's something going on.
Wow.
I'm seeing 0.3% of births are adultery. So, and there's a range of research covers all that. So therefore, there is a paper that's looked at all these papers and says, you can't trust any of these papers.
Fair play. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Alan, we'll come to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it's quite interesting to see the significance of the statement on the birth certificate. My great-grandmother, born in 1861, is shown as illegitimate on her birth certificate, but it then goes on to contain a statement from the mother, pretty much as the examples that you gave there, where she declares that she's the wife of someone else who deserted her 6 years earlier, and also declares that he is not the father of the child. So it pretty much explains that wording. Thank you.
Yes, I would say that there's a few things just to say. The earliest adultery in birth I happen to have found, and I've not systematically tried to go all the way back and find it, is 1864. And the last one I found, again, same comment, is 1944. But the big thing it's worth saying about all this is there is no legislation addresses this issue. None. In other words, this creation of the way in which these births are registered was done administratively without any politician ever being aware it was happening, without any legislation, secondary legislation, primary legislation being put in place to describe how it should be done. And indeed, in the early 1930s and through into the early 40s, there was a big argument between the Scottish administrators and the English administrators about what the Scots were doing in this and some other related matters. So it was perfectly legal for Scotland to do what it did, but it wasn't, and the word adultery appears in no legislation at all, nowhere that I've been able to find. So I suspect what actually happened is that this form of words emerged, and you might have been one of the very, very early occurrences. In fact, you might have even been the trailblazer, for all I know.
This was from the parish of Weems in Fife.
Oh, Weems, the communist Weems, of course. The last place in Scotland to have a communist MP and communist councillor as well, and in the home of Jimmy Shand.
That's right, yes.
Alan, I think you're probably going to have to pass a copy of that birth certificate across to Stewart so he can cross-check it.
Yeah, happy to do that.
Do we have any other questions, folks? Don't see anything coming up on the chat. Saw Gail's comment earlier on about, I think it was about Felix Wallace, he got longer for stealing the socks.
Yes, well,
Anything else you want to add?
if you want to talk about the criminal justice system, I've got a case in my family of someone who stole a bottle of whiskey and a coat in 1830, got transported to Australia for 7 years. The world wasn't as fair as we might now think it should be.
Rebecca has just put a comment up saying, thank you for the discussion this evening. Hang on a second, let me just get rid of it. Just by chance came across Betsy Bell's convictions just last night.
Right, yeah.
I think we're just about to close. Thank you very much for your fascinating evening looking at bigamy, adultery and murder. It's well seen how you managed to qualify and get your MSc. Congratulations on that. And for those who are in the library tomorrow, Stewart and I will both be here. Sure, there'll be another discussion on that. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll draw close to the evening there, and thank you very much for your attendance, and thank you to all of you online.
Thank you. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.